The summer air hung heavy over Manhattan in 1841, the kind that clung to the skin and made even the most elegant citizens of the city move slower through the heat. Street vendors shouted in the markets, carts rattled over cobblestones, and the Hudson shimmered with a light that seemed to melt into the haze. Inside John Anderson's Liberty Street cigar shop, however, the warmth had its own kind of allure. Gentle smoke curled through the air, mingling with laughter, flirtation, and the sweet aroma of tobacco. It was here that Mary Cecilia Rogers became a legend before anyone could have imagined her name would one day be carved into the darker side of American history. She was young, barely 20, but the city already knew her as the beautiful Cigar Girl. Those who had never met her spoke of her as though she were a figure from a poem, a woman who could make men forget their purpose just by looking at her. She had chestnut hair, soft eyes that were neither blue nor green but something in between, and a voice that could turn a polite refusal into an invitation. Customers visited Anderson's shop less for cigars than for her conversation. Politicians, artists, lawyers, and newspapermen all wanted a glimpse of the girl behind the counter who had somehow become the face of a growing city's fascination with beauty and charm. Mary lived with her mother, Phoebe, who ran a small boarding house not far from the shop. Her father had died years before, leaving the two women to fend for themselves. Yet Mary never seemed weighed down by hardship. She carried herself with a kind of gentle poise, as though life's roughness couldn't touch her. When she laughed, people turned their heads. When she walked through the streets, carriage drivers slowed their horses to stare. But beneath her soft smile, there was a private world few could see, a restlessness that seemed to follow her even when she was surrounded by admirers. On Sunday, July 25, 1841, Mary told her mother she was going to visit an aunt in the countryside. Phoebe noticed her daughter was quieter than usual that morning. She wore a light summer dress and carried her parasol, pausing before leaving to kiss her mother on the cheek. It was the last time she would ever see her alive. Hours passed, then a night, then another. Phoebe waited by the window long after sunset, telling herself that perhaps Mary had simply stayed with friends. When Monday came and went without word, dread settled into her chest. By Wednesday morning, rumors began to spread through the city. The beautiful Cigar Girl was missing. Her disappearance reached the newspapers almost immediately. Some whispered she had eloped. Others said she'd been abducted. A few suggested she had taken her own life, unable to bear the pressures of constant attention. But no one could produce proof of anything, and the gossip only grew louder. Men who once flirted with her in the shop now speculated over drinks about what might have happened. Women who envied her beauty now pitied her mother. For days, the story simmered across Manhattan until the Hudson River offered its own cruel answer. On July 28, 3 boys walking near Sybil's Cave in Hoboken noticed something floating along the water's edge. When they came closer, they saw the shape of a woman's body caught in the reeds. The discovery drew crowds almost instantly. The scene was chaotic: men shouting for the police, women weeping, reporters scribbling notes. By the time officers arrived, the sun was already dipping low, casting the river in red and gold light. The body was swollen from the water, but when someone lifted a strand of dark hair away from her face, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. It was her. Mary Rogers. Her dress was torn. There were bruises on her arms and marks around her neck that hinted at violence. The newspapers would later describe her face as bearing a peculiar expression of suffering. No one knew what had been done to her, only that it had ended brutally. The coroner's report was inconclusive. Too much time in the water had washed away many of the signs investigators relied upon. Still, the implication of foul play was unmistakable. News of her death spread through the city like fire. Within a day, every paper from the New York Herald to the Tribune had her story on the front page. Street vendors sold extra editions shouting her name into the crowd. The beautiful Cigar Girl was no longer just a figure of fascination, she had become a mystery, and the entire city demanded to know who killed her. Phoebe Rogers collapsed when she saw her daughter's body. Friends tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to give. She spoke little to anyone except the police, who came to question her repeatedly. She told them about the aunt Mary was supposed to visit, about her habits and her suitors. One name surfaced again and again, Daniel Payne, Mary's fiancé. He was a clerk, quiet, responsible, deeply in love with her. The newspapers soon found him, chasing him down for statements he was too grief-stricken to make. Reporters painted him as everything from the heartbroken lover to the possible suspect. They followed him to Mary's funeral, describing how he stood by the grave like a man hollowed out from the inside. Still, he cooperated with police, giving every detail he could remember about the last time he saw her. He swore he had nothing to do with her disappearance, that she had been cheerful and affectionate the night before she vanished. But as days passed without an arrest, the speculation deepened. A letter appeared in one of the local papers claiming that Mary had been seen in Hoboken the day she disappeared with 6 men. The anonymous writer insisted that they had been drinking, that something had gone wrong, that perhaps the men had harmed her and dumped her in the river. The police investigated, but the letter offered no names and no solid evidence. Then came another twist. Weeks after Mary's burial, a woman named Frederica Loss, who kept a small tavern near the spot where Mary's body was found, made a disturbing discovery. Her children, playing in the woods nearby, came across a handkerchief embroidered with the initials M.R. They also found a parasol, pieces of torn fabric, and a petticoat. Frederica brought them to the police immediately, claiming they belonged to the murdered girl. She also told officers she had seen Mary on the day of her disappearance, walking with a tall man with dark features. When asked who he was, she hesitated. Only later, on her deathbed, would she tell others that the man was a physician, Dr. T.P. Quigley. That revelation would become the seed of the most scandalous theory yet, that Mary Rogers had died not from an assault or a robbery, but from a botched abortion. Abortion was illegal in New York at the time, though common enough among women who feared social ruin from unwanted pregnancies. Some whispered that Mary had sought Quigley's help and that the procedure had gone wrong, leaving her dead. To avoid disgrace, the doctor or someone helping him had disposed of her body in the river. It was a theory the newspapers seized upon. They printed lurid illustrations, published letters from anonymous sources, and reprinted every rumor they could find. Some portrayed Mary as a tragic victim of men's cruelty, others turned her into a cautionary tale about vanity and sin. Whatever the angle, her story sold papers faster than anything else in years. She had become the perfect symbol for a restless, morally conflicted city, beautiful, mysterious, and doomed. Among those who followed the story with fascination was a writer living in Philadelphia, Edgar Allan Poe. He had recently gained attention for a story titled The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which introduced the world to his detective character, C. Auguste Dupin. Poe saw in Mary Rogers's case a reflection of the themes that haunted him: the fragility of beauty, the corruption of society, and the failure of reason to untangle human darkness. He began collecting every newspaper article about her death, annotating them with his own observations. In 1842, he began publishing The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, a fictional retelling of the case. In Poe's version, Mary became Marie, a Parisian perfume shop worker whose body was found floating in the Seine. Through the deductive reasoning of Dupin, Poe sought to solve her murder logically, as if pure intellect could triumph over chaos. But as the real-life investigation continued to twist and turn, Poe revised the story, adding new clues and changing the outcome. The line between fact and fiction blurred, leaving readers to wonder where truth ended and imagination began. While Poe wrote, Daniel Payne descended further into despair. Hounded by reporters and tormented by guilt, he began drinking heavily. Friends said he would wander along the riverbank where Mary's body had been found, muttering to himself. One September morning, a fisherman discovered his body near the same spot. In his pocket was a note: "To the world, here I am on the very spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life." He had poisoned himself. The man once seen as Mary's protector had chosen to die beside her memory. The city was shaken once again. Newspapers that had once accused him of jealousy and deceit now mourned him as another victim of the beautiful cigar girl's tragedy. The story no longer belonged to the living. It had become a legend woven from grief, scandal, and speculation. Even years later, people could not let it go. Some said Frederica Loss had lied about seeing Mary at all. Others swore that the abortion theory was invented by journalists hungry for scandal. There were even whispers that Mary had staged her own death to escape her life in the public eye. No proof ever surfaced for any of it. The police never arrested anyone, and the official cause of death remained undetermined. Yet the influence of her death reached far beyond the investigation. Lawmakers in New York cited her case during debates that led to the state's first anti-abortion law in 1845. Her story was also used as an example of why the city needed a professional police force, a shift that would eventually lead to the creation of the NYPD. In death, Mary Rogers had changed the city more than she ever could have in life. Still, for those who remembered her, the image that lingered was not of a symbol or a headline, but of a young woman smiling behind a counter, handing cigars to men who couldn't stop looking at her. Her charm had been innocent, her fate anything but. She had been a daughter, a fiancée, a beauty, a victim and, in Poe's hands, an immortal figure of mystery. As the years passed, the story of the beautiful cigar girl faded from the front pages, but it never truly disappeared. Her ghost lingered in the corners of the city that had once adored her. Every now and then, a historian or a writer would rediscover her name, and for a moment, the streets of 1840s New York would come alive again, the hum of the cigar shop, the glint of sunlight on the Hudson, and the whisper of a legend that refused to rest. But beneath the legend lay something far more human, the story of a young woman whose life was consumed by the curiosity of others, and whose death became a mirror reflecting the darker desires of an entire city. In the end, Mary Cecilia Rogers was not only the victim of a crime, she was the first modern victim of fame itself. The years had changed New York, but not enough to erase the shadow of Mary Rogers. Even after her burial and Daniel Payne's tragic suicide, her story lingered in conversation, in whispers exchanged at taverns, in the half-curious, half-fearful glances cast toward the river where her body was found. The city, still new in its ambition and uneven in its morality, had found in her death a reflection of itself, beautiful on the surface, rotting underneath. For weeks after, people continued to gather near Sybil's cave, staring out over the dark water as if expecting her ghost to rise again and tell them what had happened. By autumn of 1841, the first leaves began to fall across the riverbanks. The crime that had once consumed every headline now began to fade from the daily press, though no one had forgotten it. There was a growing unease in the city. It was as though Mary's murder had peeled away the skin of decency, revealing the hunger for scandal that lurked beneath. Each newspaper had used her story differently, some to sell copies, others to moralize. One called her a fallen angel destroyed by temptation. Another blamed the growing moral decay of the metropolis, claiming her death was the punishment of vanity and sin. Her mother lived quietly, rarely leaving her boarding house. Reporters who came to question her found a woman hollowed out by grief. The sight of a cigar or a folded handkerchief could make her break into tears. When she spoke of her daughter, her tone shifted between pride and agony, pride for the girl everyone adored, and agony for the way they had used her memory. Sometimes she would tell visitors that she still believed Mary might come home, that perhaps it was all a mistake. But even she could not escape the truth that her daughter's face had become a spectacle for strangers. Frederica Loss, the tavern keeper, was the next to face the city's curiosity. After the discovery of the handkerchief and parasol, her name appeared in the papers daily. Men from the press came to her tavern to drink, pretending to be customers while fishing for new details. Frederica enjoyed the attention at first. Her small establishment had never been so full. But attention in New York was fickle and dangerous. When she revealed that she had seen Mary with a dark-complexioned man before her disappearance, the gossip spread like wildfire. People demanded to know who the man was. Some claimed he was a sailor, others a doctor, and others said he was simply a phantom of Frederica's imagination. In the early winter of 1842, Frederica fell ill. Her family later said she spoke deliriously in her final days, repeating the same words over and over: "He was a doctor. He was a doctor." The confession, overheard and passed from mouth to mouth, reached the papers within a week. And with it came the explosive theory that would forever alter the legacy of Mary Rogers, that she had died not at the hands of a violent stranger, but during a secret procedure gone wrong. Abortion was a word that respectable society avoided then, but it was no secret that such services existed. Dozens of midwives and doctors quietly offered them to desperate women. To be unmarried and pregnant was a scandal that could destroy a woman's life, her reputation, her very place in the world. In that context, the theory carried a kind of grim plausibility. The public, however, turned it into something uglier. Pamphlets and broadsides appeared accusing quack doctors of preying on women's shame. Religious leaders thundered from their pulpits that Mary's death was a warning from God. The newspapers reprinted the story endlessly, each time with new embellishments. Some claimed she had gone willingly to Quigley's office. Others said she had been tricked there. No one knew the truth, but everyone felt entitled to speak it. For Edgar Allan Poe, the mystery was irresistible. He had been following the case from the beginning, his mind obsessed with the inconsistencies. What fascinated him most was not merely the crime, but how the public devoured it, how conjecture replaced evidence, and gossip replaced justice. His earlier story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, had introduced readers to a detective who could solve crimes through pure reasoning. The death of Mary Rogers seemed to call for the same method. He began writing The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, transforming the real Mary into a fictional character whose story could be examined as an intellectual puzzle rather than a tragedy. In his study, surrounded by newspaper clippings and notes, Poe worked by candlelight, dissecting each rumor. "What evidence," he wrote, "is to be found in the falsehoods of the multitude?" He believed logic could find truth even in lies. The story was serialized in The Lady's Companion, and though he changed the setting to Paris, everyone knew it was about Mary Rogers. Readers waited eagerly for each installment, trying to see if Poe's detective would succeed where the real police had failed. Poe's portrayal was careful and chilling. Through Dupin's reasoning, he examined the contradictions of witness statements, the confusion of the investigation, and the unreliable nature of the press. But as the story unfolded in print, new developments in the real case forced him to revise his narrative. When the abortion theory gained attention, Poe altered his text again, weaving in details that mirrored the rumor. His story became both fiction and commentary, a reflection of how truth itself had become malleable in the hands of journalists and moralists. Meanwhile, the real city had moved on, though never entirely. The Liberty Street cigar shop continued to operate, but the air inside had changed. Customers still came, but out of curiosity rather than habit. They whispered about the counter where Mary once stood, tracing their fingers along the wood as though it held some echo of her laughter. The owner, John Anderson, eventually replaced the counter entirely, hoping to end the morbid fascination. But it was too late, his shop had become part of the legend. Across the river in Hoboken, Sybil's Cave drew tourists. People came to see the place where the beautiful cigar girl had been found, treating it like a grim attraction. Vendors sold prints depicting her likeness, romanticized, tragic, and far too lovely for the horror she had endured. Lovers took walks along the same paths, whispering about the mystery, their curiosity tinged with superstition. The cave itself became a shrine to morbid imagination, and it stayed that way for decades. For the authorities, the case remained a failure that haunted them. The investigation had been clumsy from the start, no proper chain of evidence, no systematic search for suspects, and an over-reliance on press reports instead of police work. Many officers privately admitted that they had been overwhelmed by the sheer attention the case received. New York's police system at the time was fragmented, made up of poorly trained watchmen and political appointees. The Rogers case exposed just how unprepared they were for modern crime. By 1845, as debates raged about reforming the city's law enforcement, Mary Rogers's name surfaced again in the halls of power. Her unsolved death was cited as an example of why the city needed a centralized, professional police force. In a strange way, her tragedy helped birth the very institution that might have saved her. The moral panic surrounding her death also influenced lawmakers in another way. The rumors of an abortion, true or not, fueled public outrage and gave conservative politicians a rallying cry. That same year, New York passed its first anti-abortion law, a statute that criminalized the procedure more harshly than ever before. Behind the rhetoric of morality lay the ghost of Mary Rogers, her story twisted into justification for control over women's bodies. She had become both martyr and scapegoat for the city's conscience. Yet to the few who had truly known her, the noise of public debate meant nothing. Her mother lived out her remaining years in quiet sorrow, occasionally receiving letters from strangers claiming to have seen her daughter alive in distant towns. Some swore Mary had faked her death and fled. Phoebe never believed them, but sometimes, late at night, she would stare into the mirror and imagine her daughter walking through the door again. The truth was that no one would ever know what really happened on that warm July day. The river had taken the secrets with it. Still, people continued to write about her poems, pamphlets, stories, and essays. Artists painted her portrait from imagination, turning her into a tragic muse. Writers debated whether she had been an innocent victim or a woman undone by her choices. Each version told more about the teller than about Mary herself. When Poe's The Mystery of Marie Rogêt finally concluded, it offered no definitive solution. Dupin's reasoning pointed toward several possible explanations but stopped short of naming a killer. It was a deliberate choice. Poe wanted readers to see that certainty itself was an illusion, that logic could describe the shape of truth but never capture its whole. In that sense, his fictional Marie was as lost as the real Mary. Critics praised Poe for his analytical genius, but some accused him of exploiting tragedy for art. He did not deny it. In private letters, he admitted that the case fascinated him not because of its gore but because of its reflection of human folly. "The public mind," he wrote, "is a labyrinth of error, one must enter it to find its center." Through Mary's story, Poe had found the foundation of the modern detective tale, a way to impose reason upon chaos, even if that order was imagined. But for the people of New York, the story remained an open wound. Every generation rediscovered it and asked the same questions. Who was the man with her that day? Was it a lover, a doctor, or a stranger? Was it murder, or an accident made monstrous by rumor? None of the answers ever satisfied. The only certainty was that a young woman's life had ended violently, and her beauty had become the city's obsession. By the late 1840s, the memory of Mary Rogers began to fade from public memory. Her grave, once visited daily by strangers, grew over with ivy. Her mother died quietly, buried beside her. Sybil's cave closed, later collapsing into ruin. But even as the physical traces disappeared, her influence persisted. Poe's detective stories would give birth to an entire literary tradition. The police reforms sparked by her case would shape the future of law enforcement. And the moral panic over her supposed abortion would echo for generations. Mary's story had become something more than tragedy, it was transformation. She had entered the American imagination as a figure both real and mythical, both victim and symbol. Her life, so ordinary in its beginnings, had become a tale that refused to die, no matter how much time passed or how many details were forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, ferry captains crossing the Hudson claimed they could see a flicker of white near the water's edge, a shimmer that looked like a woman's dress floating where the river met the moonlight. They would steer clear of that spot, whispering that the beautiful cigar girl still wandered there, waiting for someone to tell her story correctly. But the truth was that no one ever could. Because the real Mary Rogers had been consumed not only by the river but by a society eager to turn her into something she was never meant to be. She had been a daughter, a worker, a dreamer, and above all, a young woman who wanted her own life. And that, more than anything, was what the city had taken from her. The beautiful cigar girl had become immortal, not by choice but by tragedy. Her story, passed from pen to pen, had transcended her body, her voice, and her time. It lived in the murmur of the Hudson, in the echo of footsteps along Liberty Street, and in the quiet sadness of every mystery that remains unsolved. The story of Mary Rogers might have faded into the sepia haze of history, but the shadow of her death lingered like a smudge the city could never quite scrub clean. By the mid-1840s, New York had changed. Gas lamps now lit the streets where she once walked, and the carriages rolled faster, their drivers shouting over the noise of progress. Yet every so often, when a body was found near the river or a woman vanished from the streets, someone would whisper her name again, the beautiful cigar girl, as if invoking her spirit could explain the darkness that seemed to pulse beneath the growing city's surface. Her story had been retold so many times that it was no longer one story at all. To some, she was a symbol of innocence destroyed by a corrupt world. To others, she was a lesson about vanity, about the dangers of fame and the hunger of men's eyes. The preachers used her name in sermons, writers borrowed her tragedy for novels, and even the police, those new, uniformed men who now patrolled the streets, used her as an example of why order was necessary. Everyone owned a piece of Mary Rogers, yet no one truly remembered the girl herself. By 1850, the Liberty Street cigar shop was gone. The city had built upward, replacing small shops with taller brick buildings. The space where she once stood laughing behind the counter was now part of a warehouse. Few who walked by knew the history that had unfolded there. Her photograph had never been taken, only sketches drawn from memory remained, each a little different from the last. In some, she looked saintly, in others, seductive. The real Mary, with her soft voice and shy humor, existed only in the fading recollections of those who had known her. For Edgar Allan Poe, her memory also refused to rest. Though years had passed since the mystery of Marie Rogêt, he continued to think of her case. Friends recalled him musing about it during long nights of conversation, his dark eyes reflecting both fascination and sorrow. He once said that Mary Rogers's story had shown him the human thirst for explanation, that need to turn tragedy into meaning. But privately, he admitted to another feeling: guilt. I borrowed from her death, he wrote, and yet, I gave her no peace. Poe himself was struggling by then, ill, poor, and haunted by the same melancholy that colored his writing. When he died in 1849 under mysterious circumstances of his own, some of his admirers drew eerie parallels between his fate and that of the woman whose death had inspired him. Both had become symbols of beauty and suffering, both were mysteries that would never be fully solved. Meanwhile, the legend of the beautiful cigar girl became a piece of American folklore. Tour guides told her story along the river, embellishing the details each year. One version claimed she had been seen in Europe years later, living under another name. Another insisted that her ghost appeared to lovers who quarreled by the water, a pale warning of jealousy and betrayal. The truth no longer mattered, it was the story that endured. But beneath the myth was a quieter legacy. The debate her death sparked about morality, justice, and the treatment of women had changed the city's laws and conscience. It exposed how easily a woman's reputation could be destroyed, how swiftly sympathy could curdle into judgment. When newspapers printed her image beside speculation about abortion or secret lovers, they had begun a pattern that would repeat for generations, the transformation of victims into spectacles. In that way, Mary Rogers was not just a figure of the 1840s but a precursor to every young woman whose tragedy would later be consumed by the public. The journalists who crowded the docks to describe her corpse were early echoes of those who would someday chase headlines across telegraphs, radios, and screens. Her death, unsolved and sensational, had taught the city something dangerous, that there was profit in sorrow, fame in fear. Still, there were those who tried to remember her kindly. A small newspaper in 1851 printed a quiet anniversary piece, describing her not as a mystery but as a daughter lost to her mother, beloved by her friends, remembered by a city that failed her. It was buried deep inside the paper, far from the headlines, but for a moment, it restored her humanity. It was the first time in a decade that anyone had written about her without asking who killed her. By the late 19th century, the last witnesses to her life were gone. The new generation knew her name only from Poe's story, where she lived on as Marie Rogêt, a fictional creation whose death could be analyzed but never felt. Readers debated Dupin's deductions in salons and classrooms, unaware that behind the puzzle lay a real woman who once smiled behind a counter and sold cigars to strangers. The detective story had been born from her tragedy, and the modern fascination with crime had begun there, in the quiet ripple of the Hudson. More than a century later, when historians rediscovered her, they found a story shaped by everyone but her. They found court documents yellowed by time, newspaper columns brittle as autumn leaves, and sketches that barely resembled one another. Yet somewhere between the lines, between the moral panic, the poetic retellings, and Poe's literary veil, was a girl named Mary, who lived simply, laughed easily, and vanished into a world that never truly saw her. In the end, that was the cruelest truth. She had been admired, adored, even loved, but not known. Her death turned her into a mirror for everyone's fears and fantasies. The men who once called her beautiful now used her image to warn other women against independence. The writers who romanticized her tragedy gave her immortality but no justice. And the city that once worshipped her face forgot the sound of her voice. Yet on quiet nights by the Hudson, the air still feels heavy with her story. The river has changed course, the cave has crumbled, but the water moves with the same restless rhythm it did that July evening in 1841. Some say that if you stand near the shore when the mist rises, you can almost hear a woman's laugh carried over the current, a sound bright and fleeting, like the memory of a life interrupted. Her name drifts in history's tide, between fact and fable, between innocence and rumor. And though no one ever found her killer,